Today we have Charles Martin who's going to talk about data-free diagnosis of deep neural networks. His research has been published in top journals like Nature Communications and JMLR, and he has also featured at top AI conferences like ICML, KDD, and NeurIPS. He's also an active member of ML community in SF, so if you guys want to hang out with him, that'll be amazing. Thank you so much, Charles. Over to you.
Great, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to do this. Okay, let me see if I can get started here. I'll tell you what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about an open source tool that I've developed called WeightWatcher, which provides data-free diagnostics for deep learning. And WeightWatcher is based on a theory I've been developing for about the past decade, which is a theory of layer convergence. So thinking about how deep neural networks converge, most people think about the loss. Today we're going to take a look at the layers, how the layers converge. Now, this work is based on a number of papers that I've been publishing for some time on implicit regularization in deep learning. There's a paper I published with Michael Mahoney at UC Berkeley and JMLR. The work was actually done in 2018. Takes a long time to publish things, so we got published in 2021. Another piece of work, and I have a number of papers. These are like the three main papers. There's probably 10 papers on this subject. Another is predicting trends in the quality of state-of-the-art neural networks without access to training or test data. And this was published in 2021, also Nature Communications. This was done with an intern of mine, Serena Ping. I run a consulting business where I do freelance consulting and help clients build ML models, companies like eBay, BlackRock. I was at Aardvark that was acquired by Google, things like this. The last thing to talk about is CEDL, semi-empirical theory of learning. This is something I've been working on now. I gave a talk at NeurIPS in 2023. There is now a full paper, which is in draft mode. Given how long things take to publish, it could be 3 years, 5 years before it gets published. But I'm happy to share the draft. It's available online on the website, and I'm happy to share it with anyone and discuss it. We also have a Discord channel for Weight Watchers. You can join the Discord channel, and I'm happy to ask questions about the tool. So I want to kind of give you what is the sort of TLDR of this. We think about a neural network. Most people, when they train a neural network, they only think about the loss function. Like, what is the loss doing? And if you really, you realize that there are layers, and the individual layers actually converge at different rates. And what I'm going to do is present a theory of layer convergence. So the idea is that as you're training, you might find that some layers converge very, very well. They actually become ideal. And I'll show you some cases of this where the layers are ideal according to the theory. There are cases where the layers just don't capture a lot of information and they become underfit. Those layers are underfit. There are cases where the layers appear just totally random. They didn't learn any information at all, or they learned such weak amounts of information that can't say much. And then there are cases where the layers overfit. They overfit to the data, and this overfitting causes them to perform poorly or less optimally on out of sample data. And this is predicted by theory, and you can see it experimentally. And so the way we're going to characterize how layers converge is by this quality metric called alpha. And this is a quality metric developed in the HTSR theory, heavy-tailed theory of self-regularization. And the WeightWatcher tool, if you give it a neural network, it will compute the alpha for you, and you can use this quality score to determine if your layers are random, they're kind of weakly or underfit, if they're overfit, or if they're ideal. This is the basic idea. The way this works is WeightWatcher takes the weight matrices of a neural network, takes the model, looks at each individual layer weight matrix. Like if you have an LLM, it would look at the K and the Q and the V and the input and the output and the gates and things like this. Each individual layer is looked at, and it does spectral analysis. So it computes the singular value decomposition. So you have weight matrix. You compute the singular value decomposition of the weights, and you get these eigenvalues. This is not a terribly hard calculation. At most, I don't think I've seen a model with more than, say, 15,000 eigenvalues. So this doesn't require a supercomputer. You just do it individually. And what you'll get is you can plot a histogram of the eigenvalues. And the histogram will tell you how much information the eigenvalues have learned. Now, you could think of this as kind of doing PCA. If you had a weight matrix and you did PCA, you might, when you start off, you might see, well, there's nothing there. The weight matrix is totally random, and I can fit the histogram to something called random matrix theory. This MP, this red line, is Marchenko-Pasteur theory. So it turns out if you have a random matrix, you can describe its eigenvalue distribution using random matrix theory. This was developed in the theoretical physics community, in nuclear physics, and later some mathematicians have worked on it. But this is, if when you start off random. As the layers learn information, some of the eigenvalues start getting large. And these eigenvalues will pull out of this bulk region, they call this red bulk, and they form spikes. And if you were to do normal PCA, you would say, well, these are the sort of the high variance components, and these are the low variance components, and these spikes contain a lot of the information. That's pretty standard stuff. Turns out something special is going on in neural networks, which is a lot more sophisticated and a lot more interesting and detailed than PCA. It turns out the eigenvalue distribution becomes heavy-tailed. It becomes heavy-tailed and it becomes power law. And this has some really important implications on convergence, and it can be described using some fairly it can be described using some techniques from theoretical physics, which may not be very familiar to people in the AI and machine learning community. In the theoretical physics community, they're very well known. So here's a very simple example. Let's say I take a weight matrix. Here's VGG13 from, when we started doing this, we were looking at computer vision models like VGG. Today we look, at DeepSeek and Llama and Quinn and things like this. And it applies, it's a universal theory. I don't know. I guess I copied this in. I should make this a little bigger so it's here. So if you look at VGG13, what you find is that if you plot the eigenvalues on a log-log scale, so this is a log scale, you plot this histogram, you can fit the eigenvalues to a straight line. And this is called a power law fit. And the slope of this line is this alpha exponent that we have here, the quality metric. And it turns out this slope is very special. In physics, it's called a critical exponent. And so when you get, as the slope, this is like alpha 3. This purple line might be alpha 3. And the red line is alpha 2. This is like an ideal case. So I picked like one of the best cases from the models we've seen. So typically, if you look at like statistical learning theory or what they teach you in school, you would just look at the largest eigenvalue. You look at this orange line is the largest eigenvalue, and that's called the spectral norm. And you might look at the spectral norm, and you might look at the spectral norm with the ratio to the total Frobenius norm, and look at things like stable rank and soft rank, and that's all fine. But it turns out there's a lot more going on. And so the slope, the structure, the shape of this curve actually tells you an enormous amount of information. So one of the important things that you can show theoretically is that when you're in ideal state, this slope is, if you plot this histogram, so rho tail is the histogram, it's the density of the tail, just the tail of the eigenvalue distribution, you can fit it to a power law exponent, meaning rho tail of lambda fits as lambda to the minus 2, and 2 is the perfect state, the ideal state. It turns out this is associated, this is what I've proven recently using something called renormalization group theory. It turns out this is associated with the start of a volume preserving or scale preserving transformation. So it turns out the sum of the log of the eigenvalues is 0. This is called the trace log condition, and it's described in the new paper. And it turns out that these two conditions appear empirically to be related. They're associated. They appear to occur. They co-occur. And there are some deep theoretical reasons for this, but the important takeaway here is that you can use these metrics to determine how well your layers are converging in a model. So let me give you an example. Let's take a look at a big model like Llama or Falcon. If you can plot a history, you measure this, you take every layer in, you take the Ks, you take the attention blocks, you split them up, you look at the individual components, you plot, you make a histogram, and you fit this curve, and you ask, what's the slope? It turns out in Llama and in Falcon 2, a lot of the layers are within this safe range. Theory predicts there's a safe range between 2 and 4, 2 and 6. There's a safe range. But when the alpha is greater than 6, the layers appear to be widely underfit. Recall that's from this slide. We're way up here. So a lot of the layers are sort of in this range right here from between ideal and underfit. But you have a lot of layers that are underfit. If you look at Falcon's very interesting because the original Falcon, all the layers are in the safe range. And then when they refit it, a lot of the layers became underfit. And so this begs the question, well, what does that mean if they're underfit? Everybody uses llama. It's a great model. Why does it being underfit? Like, what's going on here? Well, if you dig in and you look at the llama, you look at each of the individual layers. So we have the V, the up, the Q, the K, the down, and this one I crossed out the O. It turns out that the K and the Q components of the attention layer, if you plot layer ID, so this is the layer ID, move it up a little. Now you can't see it. Layer ID. So this is the data and the labels. As you go deeper into the model, deeper meaning you get closer to the labels, we can plot the alpha, and you can see, for example, this purple line is the Q, part of the attention block. You can see the Q really is near, this is near, that red line is 2. It's really very close to 2, maybe fluctuates around 3. It's very close to the line. Likewise, the K is really between like 2 and 3. It's really deep in here. So you can see there are almost near perfect correlations for the attention blocks. And this is consistent across different models. Llama's the best example. If you look at Quinn, if you look at DeepSeek, you'll see, well, DeepSeek is special as his goofy, this multi-query thing. It's different. But if you look at Llama, you look at Quinn, you look at Mistral, all the K and Q parts of the attention blocks are described almost perfectly by the theory. So again, this is something I developed, 2018, back then. It's several years later. We're looking at these models and the theories predicting it works perfectly. At the same time, there are layers that are widely underfit. In particular, the V projection layer in the attention block seems to just be all over the place. We also see sometimes the up layer, like here, this brown line, you see it gets sort of halfway through and it's all over the place. So, and again, this is consistent with different types of LLMs. With Quinn, with Mistral, you'll see the same thing, that the K and Q blocks are the strongly correlated blocks. Those are the things where the attention is happening. And these other layers are, they don't seem to require as many correlations, or maybe if they were correlated better, these models would work better. So this is a lot of how the theory works, and you can use the tool to monitor your own models. But a lot of, you may not be training foundation models. Maybe you're doing fine tuning. Fine tuning is even more interesting.
Charles,
So
like a couple of questions.
go right ahead.
On the previous slide, right? So
Yes.
higher alpha means underfitting.
Yes.
Okay, so what are the implications here, like especially for LLMs, when you say they are underfitting? Is it more hallucination, or they're not able to read
Actually, I'll
information?
show you. It turns out that alpha is correlated with hallucinations, but not as you would expect. What are the implications? My theory. This is a theory, right? And what I'm proposing is that if you can get all the layers in this range, you're going to do really, really well. It turns out that you look at like Falcon. The original Falcon had all the layers in this range, but nobody used it. So your data set really matters. What's happening here is this is a convergence theorem. So it's telling you, however you're training these models, if you, at least in the K and Q region, you want to get these systems as correlated as much as possible. The V, I'm not sure about. Some of the other parts, like the gating, you can see it's not bad. Some of them are really trying to route. Like you'll see cases like in mixture of expert models where it may not be important to have such strong correlations because you're trying to mix across experts. But this is something that we're trying to figure out. We're trying to figure out, what does this mean? Like, does it, there are cases, an example would be like, if you, I don't have it in front of me. There are cases where the green lines have huge spikes. Like if you look in the Falcon models, you're not as well correlated. And so what we would say is if the K and Q matrices are not very well correlated, the model's not going to do very well. The attention block didn't learn what it was supposed to learn. If the V is not, well, we're not sure yet. We're still trying to work this out. But let me, but I will show you some implications moving forward. Let me show you an example. One of the implications is when you're trying to fine tune models. So when you try to fine tune models, it turns out that this is instruction fine tuning. So let's say you're doing instruction fine tuning. You can do instruction fine tuning on a model like 3, which has lots of, this is 2, but 3 is the same, which has lots of underfit layers. But what does it mean? It turns out in almost all instruction fine tuned models, Llama, Mistral, Quinn, Falcon, when you look across them, the alphas lie between 2 and 4, some maybe 2 and 6. They're in this tight, safe range. So one of the things we think is that if you're going to do large scale fine tuning, when you do fine tuning, you want all the alphas to be in this range. That's something that we're starting to see, that the best models, for example, you look at Llama, The purple is the instruction fine-tune component. This is the, remember what we're doing here is we're taking the full model and we're subtracting off the base model. So this is Falcon 3, this is Falcon 3 Instruct. And we subtract off and we just get the component that was instruction fine-tuned. This seems to follow the theory very well. So what does it mean when you have large alphas? Well, it turns out that smaller alphas, generally speaking, are easier to fine-tune. So if you have alphas that are way up here in the range of 15 or 20, you might not get, if your base model, this is 70B, this is Llama 3.1, 70B base versus 70B Instruct. Well, the Instruct component, this is the Instruct component on the y-axis. All the alphas are in the safe range from 2 to 5, 2 to 6. But a lot of them are up here in the 3 to 5 range. And that's because the alphas in the base model are somewhat high. So what we think happens is that if the base model has a lot of slack in it, it might be harder to do good instruction fine-tuning. It doesn't mean you have to have everything perfect, but we definitely see a trend that it's harder to do instruction fine-tuning when the alphas aren't as good. But so that would be probably the biggest implication for people in companies is that as you look and you do your instruction fine-tuning, for example, you might need to adjust the layer learning rates on some of these layers that you're doing instruction fine-tuning, which have higher alphas, in order to get better convergence. And we have some papers showing that you can actually adjust the layer learning rates dynamically. In fact, this is something people know, right? When you train a model, there are some heuristics you can use to make the learning rate for these layers is typically larger than the learning rate for these layers when you do instruction fine-tuning. This is something that's kind of known in the literature. It was pointed out years ago. Using WeightWatcher, you can actually selectively tune these rates. Does that answer your question on the implication? I want to make sure I caught that.
Yes, it does. And one more question on the theory, right? So usually, like we try to minimize loss function. Like,
That's correct.
how does it the layer convergence interplay with minimizing loss function?
Well, it turns out that'll get to that. Okay, so that is a complicated question because it has to do with the shape of the energy the shape of the landscape appears to be more rugged. It's more convex. Alpha is a measure of convexity. So there's a duality between the loss function and the alphas. And what we believe is happening as the alphas get smaller, as they approach 2, the loss function becomes more convex for that part being described by the weight matrix. I don't have that in this talk, but I can follow up with that and explain to you. That's actually a very old idea from theoretical physics. I mean, that dates back to like the 90s in physics. This is known about random energy landscapes. So these are
Can you
things
can
that
you
are,
like regularize based on the alpha? Like, can you actually like bake this into a loss function, maybe approximate it with some like spectrum like algorithms, so it's like not as expensive to calculate the eigenvalues, but like, is it something that you can
well, how
just
would
bake
you,
in?
the problem with putting into the loss, there are several issues with this. First of all, the alpha only converges it's only good near convergence. So if you're early in the stages, so if we go to, I'll go down a minute here and I'll come back up. In the HCSR theory, you have sort of this fixed point relation, which is governing convergence. And in early stages of training, you might, this sort of last phase is where you're heavy tailed. You might be in one of these regions where you can't get a good alpha fit. But I think the more important thing is that alpha is a layer quality metric. So, even if I'll come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
The point is that you would have to have, if you have like a model like DeepSeek has 5,000 layers, right? You would have to have an alpha for every layer in the loss function, and you'd have to have some coefficient which you would optimize because there'd be you'd have 5,000 regularization coefficients. So how would you do that? You'd have to use some very expensive, I think, reinforcement learning to figure out how to optimize the layer like that. So I think that would be really hard to add it into the loss function directly, just because it's a per layer metric. It's not a total metric. So we have some papers where we've shown how to do dynamic adjustment of the layer. I can send you some papers on how you adjust. Basically, what I advise people is not to try to put in the loss function, but to try to adjust the layer learning rates. And when you adjust the layer learning rates, you can control the convergence properties, and that way, and you have some idea of what those layer. But we could talk about that in some detail. But that's essentially the. Does that make sense? Why it's hard to put into the loss function?
I think you can do it, but like yeah, I would like it
I mean,
would it would definitely be a
I'm
project.
happy to have you try it, right? I mean, I'm not against it. I'm just pointing out that doing it for like a 3-layer MLP, not a big deal. Doing it for DeepSeek, which has 5,000 layers, that would be an issue, right? So, I want to show you some other, but I think these are things we have to explore. But I also want to point out that you really have to think carefully about what you want to do. Overfitting is not always bad. So you have overfitting, you have underfitting. We've talked a little bit about the overfitting and how the overfitting can complicate fine tuning. And sort of what my advice would be if to try to do sort of a heuristic to adjust the layer learning rates for your fine tuning. The theory also, more importantly, can predict overfitting. And this is one of the key aspects of the theory that you can see when the alphas are less than 2, we believe that the model is that the layer is overfitting the data a little bit. And we have some good theoretical reasons for believing this and experiments, very careful, detailed experiments showing this. Here, I'll give an example of segment anything models. In the segment anything models, it appears that some of these early layers are actually overfit. And what I suspect is going on here is that in order to do segment anything, this is, for example, like in segment VIT or SAM1, SAM2, you have to memorize some abstract feature which is shared among various images. So I think what's happening here is that when you train segment anything models, they're trained in such a way to memorize these very, very abstract features, which are shared between different images, so you can do zero shot. Because segment anything models are used for zero shot learning. So we think that that's what's happening. And so sometimes overfitting is good. So optimizing the alpha, the thing is you don't want alpha to go below 2. 2 is the ideal spot, but you can have less than 2, and that might be useful in some cases. There's also cases where overfitting is bad. For example, in the guard models, people are trying to build guard models to, they're trying to prevent you from asking the LLM questions for whatever reason. Maybe it's whatever they want to have some safety concern. And the guard models, they also show overfit alphas. And here's an example of the guard model: Llama Guard 3.1, Llama Guard 3.8. 3.1b, 3.8b, and you see there are a lot of alphas that are less than 2. They're in the overfit zone. They're actually the later. They're the less abstract features. They're closer to the labels. And I think what's happening in some of these guard models where you're trying to enforce safety is that you're memorizing basically the training data. You're memorizing specific features about the training data, which makes the model very brittle. And so the point being that typically when we see training, we very frequently see layers that are close to the data. Usually maybe just like the first 5% of the layers are overfit. That's a very common thing to see. When you see layers like way toward the labels that are overfit, my suspect that these models can be quite brittle. Moving on to some things that we can describe with a theory which other theories don't describe very well. One of the things you may have heard about is double descent. So double descent, and there's a lot of argument, what is double descent, and it's very confusing to people. Double descent was described in the theoretical physics literature in the late 80s. And it was described immediately. There are plenty of papers on this. There's a paper by Opper, back when I was a grad student in the 90s, that describes double descent. Not a problem to describe. We understand exactly what it is in the physics literature. So this is a problem with statistical learning theory, because statistical learning theory they didn't really understand how to deal with this phase behavior. What's going on here, I want to show you that if you apply WeightWatcher to the original double descent problem from 1989, it works perfectly. So in this problem, what they're doing is they take a linear regression model and they fit a linear regression to a bunch of binary labels, to a massively over-parameterized system, something with almost an exponential number of binary labels. And you find that when you do this, there's an over-parameterized and an under-parameterized regime. And the over-parameterized regime has this sweet spot, and you get these curves that sort of look like this. And if you treat WeightWatcher in the over-parameterized regime and you measure the alpha on the, and I have a blog post describing this, you actually get right at the sweet spot where the double descent has the sweet spot where you're in the over-parameterized regime, where this simple model has the best accuracy. And the best accuracy is only like 65%. Like, it's not a great, highly accurate model. But where the test accuracy is 65%, the alpha's 2, and the trace log condition holds perfectly. So this is a case where I didn't actually know. I sort of went back and got the old double descent paper, reworked up the experiment, and it works perfectly. Another example where the theory works as predicted is with grokking. People trying to figure out what is grokking. Grokking is this thing where you train a model. This is an example. We reproduced this model on the Discord channel. We're going to have a paper publishing coming out with this soon. With one of the guys in the Discord channel did this work. We train an MLP, ReLU 200 with MLP on minced, and you can initiate grokking. Grokking means that if you train the model for a period of time, this is the training accuracy. The training accuracy will saturate, gets to interpolation, but the test accuracy is basically it's 1%, so it's zero here. It's random. And then all of a sudden, the test accuracy jumps and we get like 85% test accuracy with this model. If you track the layer alphas, you'll see that the layer alpha, there's one layer which is very random. It's up at 10. It's basically random. And so the training is being described by one layer. There are 3 layers here, but there are these 2 layers, which the green layer is the output layer. So it only has 10 eigenvalues. So that's not so important. What's important here are the blue and the orange curve. The orange curve, you can see layer 1 basically fits the training data, but layer 2 hasn't learned, layer 0 hasn't learned anything. So this is FC1, FC1, FC2, FC3, and MLP. So the blue layer hasn't learned. All of a sudden, when the grokking kicks in, bam, you see this phase transition where the alphas they shrink, then they blow up, and then they decay. And this phase behavior is right at the onset of the grokking. And in fact, not only do we see that, but we even see that right at the end. If you train for a long time, you see there's this little dip in the test accuracy right here at the end. And it turns out the alphas drop. You can't see it in this curve. The alphas actually drop below 2. And the trace log condition also drops below 0. So we can actually observe grokking with the theory. We see the onset of grokking. We see this sort of phase transition kick. We see the relaxation. And we can even detect overfitting in the test data using the theory. And again, this is all reproducible. I'm happy to share a notebook with you where you can do all this yourself and try it. Finally, someone asked about hallucinations. It turns out that, and I can talk about this some more. Look, hallucinations have been known in the physics community forever. Ever since Hopfield made his 1982 wrote this 1982 paper on the Hopfield associative memory, it was understood very, very quickly. And by the way, Hopfield won the Nobel Prize recently for developing the Hopfield associative memory, the foundation of neural networks. It was known immediately these systems hallucinate. The Hopfield is a generative memory, and it hallucinates. And it's perfect in the theoretical physics explanation for hallucinations. Very clear what's going on. It turns out that the average alpha appears to be weakly correlated with hallucinations. So this is like average alpha. So here I take all of these base models, like a whole bunch of models. I did this about a year and a half ago. So Falcon GPT, Llama, OPT, Vicuña. I took all these models, took the base model, ran the average alpha, and measured it against the truthful QA metric. And you get this really interesting weak correlation between models that have smaller alphas on average tend to be less truthful. And what I would say is that, well, the model's working better, right? These models have always had these sort of hallucinations in them. They're a result of the complexity of the energy landscape. And as the landscape becomes more and more ruggedly convex, you get this chance to sort of jump around into various saddle points and local minima, and you generate hallucinations. So this is an interesting, this isn't published, it's just on the website, but it's an interesting qualitative thing we discovered that, and at some point I want to redo this, that the hallucination appears to be that the better the model is, the more it hallucinates. And I would say that hallucinations for me are a feature. They're not a bug. I mean, you're asking the model to generate a memory, and it's generating something, and it's trying to generate something that you want to hear. So if it doesn't know how to do it, it'll make it up for you. It's a controversial topic, but this is the result on hallucinations. Now, it also turns out we can detect something called correlation traps. There's another part of the theory which shows why is it when alpha drops below 2 that you get overfitting? Well, this can be seen by looking at the structure of the weight matrix. So you can look at your individual weight matrices. You can take the weight matrix. This is a plot now on a log linear scale. So this is log eigenvalue, this is linear. It's easier to see what's going on this plot. And WeightWatcher generates this plot for you. If you train a model with really spuriously large learning rates, you try to crank the learning rate up, what happens is you get these weird perturbations in the weight matrix. So the green plot is a histogram of the eigenvalues. The red plot is I'm going to take the weight matrix, I'm going to randomize it element wise to pretend it's IID. The weight matrices are obviously not IID. They're learning patterns. If you randomize them, you plot, you'll get a nice Marchenko-Pasteur plot. This red plot is predicted by theory perfectly. But in cases where you have training with spuriously large learning rates and other weird things, you get weird large rank 1 perturbations in the actual matrix. So that you get like some weird weight matrix element, some Wij, which is really large. And it's so large that it actually screws up the eigenvalue spectrum. So this is, for example, I think why people like to do clipping. In the old days, you would clip the weight matrix to prevent these traps from appearing. And so we can detect these traps using random matrix theory. And what you're plotting here is this is the largest eigenvalue of the randomized matrix. And you can see in a system that's well correlated, the green and the red are totally different. In a system that has a trap, the green and the red plots look almost identical. They're a little shifted. And most of the learning is occurring in this weird little shelf here. So these things tend to screw up the alpha and make it smaller. This is another reason why adding alpha directly to the loss function is not always is difficult, because this will actually make these traps will make alpha to seem smaller than it should be. And so if you add alpha to the loss function, you could actually in fact induce correlation traps. So you have to look out for things like this, and you'd have to have some additional regularizing term to prevent the trap from forming. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to get a little more into the theory, but this is sort of I want to give you a sort of a bird's eye view of all the different things that we can do with the application. We have a number of other papers, things like we can train LoRa models in 20% of the memory anyone else does. We can do dynamic learning rates. You can do compression. You can use the WeightWatcher alpha to compress. You can use it as a compression ratio. So you can take alpha, you can stick it into an off-the-shelf LLM compressor and use it to adjust the rank of the individual weight matrices to get optimal compression. So some of the students at UC Berkeley and off, I've sort of worked with them. I've given they've gone off and done this on their own, just applying the theory. And they have a number of papers like this. But now I kind of want to talk. I'm going to just kind of stop here for a minute, ask if anyone has any additional questions. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the theory. Okay, I'll give it a. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question if no one else can ask one.
I'm sorry, you're totally muffled. Can you ask it again?
Yeah, one is as you go like more and more models have like more and more parameters, more and more to learn.
I'm sorry, you're totally muffled. Can somebody else? I just can't. I can't hear you at all.
Yeah, Pablo, like your voice is breaking up. Do you mind typing the question?
Oh, okay.
Oh, there's a chat window here. Let me try to get the chat.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now, or?
I can hear you now.
You
Yeah.
can hear me. Okay, awesome. No, my question was related to the like the observation of like emergence of outliers
Yes.
in layers as a model scales, and how does that relate to like how does that change? I mean that would change the spectrum, right? So I wonder how that.
Well, what happens when you get these weird correlation traps? It causes alpha to drop below 2, or it shrinks it anomalously. I can send you a preprint of our paper. I warn you, it's a monograph. It's 120 pages long, but we go into very explicit detail of explaining why these traps occur. And then we show very specific experiments where you can train a model by systematically increasing the learning rate and then inducing the trap, and you can see exactly what happens. But what's happening is that because the alpha is kind of a measure of the spectral norm. Smaller alphas mean larger spectral norms. The problem is, and this is part of the problem with theory. Like if you look at what people are doing in statistical learning theory, they'll say, well, you have a spectral norm. I go, spectral norm of what? Is it the spectral norm of the weight matrix or the spectral norm of the randomized weight matrix? Because if you assume the weight matrix is IID, then you get a completely different spectral norm. And so what happens is this large rank 1 perturbation in the underlying W screws up the correlation structure of the matrix and induces a kind of overfitting. And so what's happening is we think that this is causing the layer to overfit to some feature in the data. And there's some, like, it's kind of just locking in on this, and it's just zooming in on it, and maybe that's a good thing, like if you're doing some kind of zero shot learning. But generally, what we find is that when you see these traps, it decreases the out of sample accuracy. What does it mean in a larger model? You mean you got to realize I'm doing all this on my own in my spare time. I have no funding, so I haven't been able to go into like a large model like Llama and figure out, okay, if I do an ablation study, like what is the specific feature that it's fitting? That I don't know. But we do see that it's associated with decreased out of sample performance on things like MINST. Does that answer the question?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about the theory behind.
I think Pedro, you had a question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
But I mean, if we, it seems like you might get into this. Who knows? But I know you mentioned like critical values, phase transitions, and kind of like eigenvalue distributions.
That's right.
So my question is, what is / is there a relationship here to the Tracy-Wyden distribution?
Well, yeah. What's happening here is when you measure the correlation trap, what I'm doing here is I'm fitting. What WeightWatcher will do is it fits this it randomizes the weight matrix, computes the histogram of eigenvalues, fits it to a Marchenko-Stir distribution, and then looks for any rank 1 perturbation or eigenvalue outside the Tracy-Wyden fluctuation. So there's a little gap here that you would expect to be the Tracy-Wyden fluctuation, and what you find is you'll see outliers which live outside. When they live outside the Tracy-Wyden fluctuations, we think they're really bad.
Gotcha.
That's what's going on. You're welcome. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about the theory. Now, the theory, it's a very rich analytic theory. I'm just going to kind of qualitatively describe to you what's going on. Anyone who wants to go through all the math, I'm happy to share the paper with you. You can join the Discord channel. We kind of have a reading group where we go through it. It takes a little while to derive all of this, but all of this can be derived from first principles using techniques from statistical mechanics. You think about what's going on here. You imagine that each layer is described by some sort of fixed point equation by backprop. So we run backprop. Each of these, this represents a neural network. Each of these is a layer. So this middle layer here is a W. So you can think of the W as being associated with this middle layer. As you run as you run forward and back, as you go through backprop over and over, or even if you just run, even if you just go online learning, you just just do one pass over the data, which in my time was called Hebbian learning. What you find is that the effective rank of the weight matrix gets smaller. In other words, when you start off, you have a random matrix, and what's happening is you're concentrating the correlation into some small rank subspace of the layer, as a posture of doing this. And this is we suspect this is associated with some kind of fixed point equation for each layer. In the HCSR paper, this is the 2021 paper in JMLR. What we describe as a sort of phenomenology, where you imagine you start off in a model and you initialize it with a random matrix. Very quickly, you begin to see sort of spikes pulling out, but there's still a lot. The model is still described by most of this. Just the correlations are starting to concentrate in the tail. You get this sort of bulk plus spike region where they separate out from the tail. Then the tail itself starts to decay, and you end up with a heavy tail distribution. So you can imagine that during the course of the iterations that you see this sort of convergence happening where the correlations are forming and they concentrate into the tail. And they will actually at some point concentrate completely into the tail, and you'll get a complete separation where if you just keep this region, if you just truncate, you do SVD on this matrix and you throw this away, you can actually reproduce the test accuracy exactly. And we have experiments that show this when you're in the ideal state. This is associated in something in physics called renormalization group. So what happens is, as you're going through this series of transformations, the system eventually reaches this fixed point. The fixed point is described by this renormalization group equation, or in the paper, it's called a trace log condition. You can imagine there's a student-teacher model, so we call the weight matrix S and the correlation matrix A. This is just W transpose W. And what happens is you have this transformation where I'm trying to do an integral over all matrices. If I try to do an integral over all matrices, in the theory, you end up having to do an integral over all matrices. It turns out you have to do a transformation to a lower rank space where you're integrating over all correlation matrices, and you get this effect where, that's not a great picture, where if you look at the eigenvalue spectrum, all the correlations concentrate in this low rank subspace called the effective correlation space, and the slope of the eigenvalue distribution becomes 2, and the system satisfies this trace log condition. So this fixed point equation is actually, you actually derive this is in our CETO paper. Sorry, let me just do that. In our new paper, I actually derive all of this from first principles. I demonstrate, what is this Hamiltonian? This is a free energy. What does the renormalization group transform look like? Why does it describe the generalization accuracy of a layer? And in the end, you can derive this condition that the determinant of this matrix or the trace log ends up being 0. And this is something you can test. So this is sort of like a bird's eye view of what's going on. And again, this can all be derived from first principles. If you want to get into the hairy math, I'm happy to do it. What happens is if you take any layer, like I take, again, this VGG19 FC1, if I fit it to a power law, I have to, when I fit it to a power law, I use an MLE estimator. You have to choose the start of the tail. The power law starts here at this red line. If you assume that the correlations concentrate in the tail and they satisfy this trace log condition, which is this, I call it dead X in the WeightWatcher tool. You say dead X equals 1. You get and you say what eigenvalue would I pick so that all these, if I take the product of all these eigenvalues, they're close to 1. That turns out to be this purple line. And it turns out this purple line and this red line almost identically coincide when, as alpha gets closer and closer to 2, they almost identically coincide. And we show this empirically in the paper. And this alpha is why we think this is the critical exponent from the renormalization group transformation. I'll give you an example. So here's an example. We look at a number of, the paper has a whole bunch of examples. I just picked some here where you can look at like Falcon or Llama. You can plot the layer alpha versus this distance, this delta lambda min is the distance between these two eigenvalues. You can also just count the number of eigenvalues. That's even a better metric. And what you find is this distance goes to 0 as alpha approaches 2. This distance approaches 0. You get this nice funnel plot. If you do it with Llama 65b, you find that, wow, there are some alphas that are right at 2. Remember I told you in the Llama models, the K and Q layers approach 2. They're like right in here. And you can see this dead X condition is almost perfectly satisfied. And moreover, when alpha is less than 2, the dead X condition becomes 0. It becomes less than 0. So when alpha is less than 2, the red line pushes to the left of the purple line. And WeightWatcher will generate all these plots for you. You can look, here's an example we did in the paper. I guess the order's wrong. We did an example where we train a multi-layer perceptron on Minst. And I brought another guy in, Chris Hendricks, who redid all these experiments for me independently to verify them. And again, we have all the notebooks. You can do all this yourself if you want to test it. Here you see that if you plot, as you change the learning rate, this is FC1 and FC2. As you adjust the learning rate, you increase the learning rate from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32. You plot alpha versus this delta. You see the alpha starts going to 2, and when it reaches 2, bam, you get right at 0. The layer FC2 doesn't quite make it. It turns out most of the information in this model is contained in FC1. We describe in the paper what's going on here. If you look at FC1 again, if you increase the batch size, which is the same effect as increasing the learning rate, you see sort of decrease the batch size, which is the same as increasing the learning rate. You see the same effect. You can drive the alpha down. You get an optimal test accuracy, and the dead X condition, the alpha condition hold. You can see this in a number of models: VGG, ResNet, VIT, DenseNet. Basically, almost any model you look at, and you plot the layer alpha versus this delta lambda condition, you'll get these funnel-like curves. And the theory where the alphas are close to 2, you'll see the renormalization group condition or the trace log condition holds. So I'm going to make a comment. I'm going to kind of stop. And again, we can go through all the math if you want. Basically, my sort of position on this is that theories have to be tested empirically. So if I have a theory, I want to make empirical predictions. The theory makes a prediction. I give you a tool. You can use the tool to run on your models. You can test if the predictions are correct or not. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, and we'll try to figure out what's going on. I'll give you some of the motivation for where this started, because it really came from neuroscience. In neuroscience, and when I was doing AI in the 90s, I did my postdoc, I did my PhD work with Carl Fried. You may know my more famous classmate, John Jumper. He just won the Nobel Prize for AlphaFold. And then I did my postdoc with Jürgen Schmidhuber's PhD advisor. So I've been doing this a long time. I kind of did it a lot in the 90s, went away and got in the industry, and now I've come back. One of the things we used to do is we'd study spiking neurons. There was a theory in the 90s called self-organized criticality, which would say if you study the activity pattern of neurons, these are like real neurons now, like neurons, cultured neurons, and you watch how they spike, they exhibit these interesting spatial correlation, temporal spatial correlation patterns, which can be fit to a power law. And it turns out that these power laws, they exhibit universal critical behavior, and you get sort of nice plots. And in WeightWatcher, you'll see both these kinds of curves. So the actual idea from WeightWatcher actually came from taking a tool from neuroscience and trying to apply the tool of looking at how the correlations concentrate in neurons and seeing, well, would that happen in the activation structure of a neural network? And I realized, well, the activations are really hard to measure because you need to have all the data. But what if I just look at the weight matrix itself, and it turned out the correlation, and I realized mathematically, if the correlations are in the activation patterns of the neural network, they have to be in the weight matrices as well. And obviously, in a spiking neuron, you can't see the internal structure. But with a neural network, you don't need to look at the activations. You can look at the weight matrix directly. And so what we find is this WeightWatcher actually seems to align with something called the critical brain hypothesis, which is evidence of self-organized criticality. And that's why you have this renormalization group theory and why you have this phase behavior, because there's a type of self-organization occurring. And what we find is this is exactly the things that were predicted this is, by the way, this is predicted by a guy named Per Bach in a very famous book in the 90s called How Nature Works. Per Bach died I think in his 40s. So he was like a genius. He discovered a lot. He discovered all this stuff, and the field kind of died away because he passed away very early. But what we find is that as neural systems become more complex, they exhibit power law and then truncated power law structure. And we see the exact same behavior in neural networks. As we start looking at the weight matrices of neural networks, you see power law behavior in the correlation structure, and you can even see truncated power law behavior. So the truncated power, I haven't talked about that, but we see the truncated power law behavior as well. This is something called Dragon Kings, and we observe this in models like Mistral, and we can talk about that another time if you want. Anyway, I'll sort of stop here. I'm just going to point out that all of this is in the WeightWatcher tool. WeightWatcher is an open source tool, weightwatcher.ai. We have right now, I think, about 175,000 downloads and over 1,000 stars on GitHub. And we're just looking for early adopters and collaborators, people who want to try the tool out, want to test the theory, stress test the theory, figure out what's going on. There's a Discord channel. You can join the Discord channel. You can talk about what we're doing. And again, I do consulting work, and I'm happy to come in and work with you with WeightWatcher to help you analyze your models. So I'm going to stop there and ask if anyone has any additional questions.
Like, so for Stripe specifically, right? We are not in the business of building foundation models,
Right.
right? So, like, how can we apply this? Like, for example, right? Obviously, like we have models that make predictions, right? So, like how would we even think of applying this?
Well, do you fine tune models?
Yeah, we do.
Well, that's where you would apply it when you're fine tuning. You would look at the fine tuning update and try to see if the fine tuning updates is following the predictions of theory, and you could use it to look for anomalies or to try to optimize your fine tuning process.
And what about pure DNN models that are used for predictions, let's say fraud predictions, right? So that's why I was asking about.
Oh, no, this is a general purpose theory. I talked about LLMs, but this applies to all. It's a universal theory. It applies to multi-layer perceptrons. It applies to convolutional nets. It's a universal thing. So if you're training basic fraud models, yeah, if the models fit into the theory, it applies best to models with large, linear, dense layers. Okay, so it's random matrix. So you're analyzing eigenvalues. So it works well on LLMs because they have you have some giant layer with 15. They have these Q and K layers which are buried inside the attention block that are gigantic, and that we know are low rank. It doesn't apply to LSTMs. LSTMs are a bad example because they're very long and thin, so they don't have a lot of eigenvalues. So there's no structure. You can't see anything. It doesn't think that there isn't a renormalization process happening, but you need to do something a little different to analyze SLSTMs. But it just depends on the type of models you're training. If you're training MLPs or you're doing convolutional nets, things like that, then the theory applies quite well.
Got it. Any other questions?
I mean, I'll even point out everything we know about the theory we learned by just applying MLP to MNIST. Like, I don't have, I can't really train model. I can't train my own foundation model, obviously, at home on my 16 gigabyte MacBook. So I've done very deep analytic work, and almost everything we know has either come from, looking at MLPs, or convolutional nets, and basically looking at thousands of pre-trained models. Like, since I can't train my own models, the idea was, well, I'll be like a chemist. I'll look at models other people have trained and try to reverse engineer what they're doing. And that's where the theory has come from.
Got it. And how do for future work, right? Like, how do we like contact you? What is the best way to contact you? And also, like you mentioned, the Discord server is
right. So you can go to WeightWatcher. You can go to WeightWatcher.ai. There's a community. Click on community. That'll get you to the Discord server. And you can contact me there. Get me on LinkedIn. Send me an email. Come visit me in San Francisco. I'm here. So
all right.
That's how it works.
Recording
Thank you so
stopped.
much, Charles.
Thank
Very
you.
amazing presentation. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Well, I appreciate